People like you don't belong here." The words cut through the excited murmur of the crowd like a knife, leaving absolute silence in their wake. Every head turned toward the young man in worn jeans and a simple button-up shirt, standing frozen beside the gleaming limited edition Aston Martin. His hand, which had been hovering reverently above the car's carbon fiber hood, withdrew as if burned. The manager's voice had been deliberately loud, designed to humiliate, to establish the natural order of things in this temple of automotive luxury. The Beverly Hills showroom glittered like a diamond vault, polished marble floors reflecting the strategic lighting that made each vehicle appear to be carved from liquid metal. Champagne flowed freely among the guests in designer suits and cocktail dresses, their collective net worth rivaling the GDP of a small nation. This wasn't just a car launch, it was a social event, an affirmation of status. In one corner, partially hidden by a pillar, a man in tinted glasses observed the scene, his expression changing as the confrontation unfolded. Few had noticed Robert Downey Jr.'s arrival. He'd slipped in quietly, without fanfare. The manager's hand clamped firmly on the young man's shoulder, steering him toward the exit. "This is an invitation-only event for serious buyers," he announced loudly, making a spectacle of the ejection. Several guests chuckled. Some looked uncomfortable, but none intervened. The young man's face burned with humiliation, but there was something else in his eyes: knowledge, passion, and a deep understanding of what he was being denied. As they approached the door, a calm voice cut through the uncomfortable tension. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The voice belonged to Robert Downey Jr., who had stepped out from his corner vantage point. The manager's demeanor shifted instantly, his rigid posture softening, his dismissive scowl transforming into a deferential smile. The young mechanic, Alex Reyes, stood frozen, caught between embarrassment and disbelief as the actor approached. For a moment, everything in the showroom seemed suspended, the ambient chatter fading to nothing as all eyes tracked the celebrity's deliberate movement across the gleaming floor. "Mr. Downey, what an honor," the manager gushed, releasing Alex's shoulder to extend his hand toward the actor. "I was just explaining to this gentleman that our event tonight is strictly for invited guests and potential buyers." Robert ignored the outstretched hand, instead turning his attention to Alex, whose face still burned with humiliation. The young man stood awkwardly, his calloused hands, the hands of someone who worked with engines daily, now shoved deep into his pockets. He was clearly out of place amid the designer suits and champagne flutes, but there was something in his eyes that caught Robert's attention. Genuine passion, the kind that couldn't be bought with any amount of money in this room. "I heard what you said," Robert replied evenly, his gaze finally shifting back to the manager. "That this event is for people who understand these cars." The subtle emphasis made it clear he was challenging the manager's actual words rather than the sanitized version. The manager's smile faltered slightly. Around them, the exclusive crowd had gone silent. Champagne glasses paused midway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. The launch of the Aston Martin Valkyrie, only 150 units worldwide, each already spoken for at $3.2 million, had just become secondary to the drama unfolding on the showroom floor. "Of course, Mr. Downey, you're absolutely right." The manager recovered smoothly. "We simply want to ensure that our prestigious clients have the optimal experience tonight." His hand returned to Alex's shoulder, the grip firmer than necessary. "I'm sure this young man would be more comfortable elsewhere." Several onlookers nodded in agreement. A woman in a red designer dress whispered audibly to her companion, "It's like letting a dishwasher into a Michelin-starred kitchen," triggering scattered laughter. The casual cruelty hung in the air, reinforcing the invisible barriers between those who belonged and those who didn't. Alex's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. This wasn't his first encounter with such treatment, but having it happen so publicly in front of someone he admired made it cut deeper. He'd saved for months just to buy the suit he was wearing, had researched every specification of the Valkyrie, had even worked briefly at a factory that produced components for Aston Martin engines. None of that mattered here. "What's your name?" Robert asked, ignoring the manager and the murmuring crowd. "Alex. Alex Reyes, sir," the young man replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "And what do you think of the Valkyrie, Alex?" Robert gestured toward the car that gleamed under the strategic lighting, its carbon fiber body seeming to absorb and then release the light in ways that defied physics. The question hung in the air. The manager gave a condescending smile, clearly expecting a simplistic response that would justify his earlier dismissal. Several of the wealthy patrons exchanged knowing glances, anticipating entertainment at the young man's expense. But something changed in Alex's demeanor. When he spoke, his voice took on a quiet confidence that commanded attention. The Cosworth 6.5-liter V12 engine is a naturally aspirated masterpiece. They've managed to make it rev to 11,100 RPM, which is almost unheard of for a naturally aspirated engine. But what's truly revolutionary is how they've integrated the Rimac electric motor system with the internal combustion engine to optimize both power delivery and energy recovery. The technical precision of his answer was unexpected. A few heads turned in surprise. Robert's expression remained neutral, but there was a gleam of interest in his eyes. The manager's smile had frozen in place, his hand dropping from Alex's shoulder as he realized his miscalculation was about to be exposed before the room's most influential guest. A momentary silence followed Alex's technical breakdown. Robert nodded thoughtfully, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly as he turned toward the manager. "I'd say he belongs here more than most, wouldn't you?" The manager's smile remained plastered on his face, but his eyes had hardened. "Memorizing specifications from a brochure is one thing, Mr. Downey. Understanding the soul of an Aston Martin is quite another." He gestured broadly at the other guests. "Our clients don't just purchase these vehicles, they form relationships with them." "Is that right?" Robert's tone was light, conversational, but carried an undercurrent that made several guests shift uncomfortably. He turned back to Alex. "Tell me something about this car that isn't in the press release." Alex hesitated only briefly before stepping closer to the vehicle, careful not to touch it. "The aerodynamics are incredible, but they had to make sacrifices for it. See how the cabin is squeezed?" He gestured to the teardrop-shaped cockpit. "The designers argued for weeks about every millimeter. Newey, the Formula One engineer who designed it, he kept fighting for performance over comfort until they found the balance." A man in an impeccably tailored suit scoffed audibly. Anyone could read that in Road and Track. "Actually," Alex continued, unfazed, his eyes never leaving the car, "that was from my conversation with one of the composite technicians who worked on the prototype. I did an apprenticeship at the facility that made the carbon fiber panels for testing." His voice carried no boastfulness, only a matter-of-fact certainty that could not be challenged. The dynamic in the room shifted subtly. Several guests looked at Alex with newfound interest. A woman who had earlier rolled her eyes now appraised him more carefully. The manager's composed facade began to crack as he realized he was losing control of the situation before the celebrity guest he had hoped would provide the perfect Instagram moment for the dealership. "Enough of this distraction," the manager announced, clapping his hands as if to draw attention back to the planned proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen, we should continue with our presentation. The Valkyrie represents the pinnacle of automotive engineering and exclusivity." He gestured toward a tall, elegant woman in a black dress. "Our brand ambassador will now guide us through the vehicle's unique features." But Robert wasn't finished. "Actually, I'm quite interested in Alex's perspective. You know," he addressed the room conversationally, "when I was preparing for my role as Tony Stark, I spent time with engineers and mechanics, not executives. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, nervous but genuine. I found that the people who actually build and understand the machines often have the most insightful things to say about them. The manager's face flushed with barely contained frustration. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. His carefully orchestrated event hijacked by an uninvited guest and an unpredictable celebrity. He made a subtle gesture to security, two suited men who had been standing discreetly by the doors. "Perhaps we could continue this fascinating conversation after the official presentation," the manager suggested firmly. "We have many eager guests waiting to learn about their investments." "Investments?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "I thought we were talking about cars, passions, dreams." He turned to the gathered crowd. "How many of you here actually drive your supercars regularly, not just parade them or store them as appreciating assets?" The question hung uncomfortably in the air. A few hands raised tentatively, but many of the guests suddenly found their champagne glasses intensely interesting. The security men had begun to move subtly closer, though they appeared uncertain about how to handle the situation. Confronting a major celebrity was not in their training manual. "I drive mine," came a voice from the back. An older gentleman in a simple but expensive suit stepped forward. "Every Sunday, rain or shine." He nodded respectfully to Robert, then turned to Alex. "Young man, what would you do with a car like this if you owned one?" Before Alex could answer, the manager interjected, "That's an entirely hypothetical." "I'd drive it," Alex said simply, speaking over the manager. "Not just on perfect days or closed tracks. I'd learn every sound it makes, every vibration. I'd know exactly how it responds in rain, in cold, in heat." His voice had taken on a quiet intensity that commanded attention. These cars aren't meant to be perfect showpieces. They're meant to be experienced. They're alive when they're driven. The older gentleman nodded appreciatively. "Exactly right." "This is all very touching," the manager said, his tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. "But it doesn't change the reality that this event is for qualified buyers only." He turned to Robert. "Mr. Downey, we're honored to have you, of course, but we must proceed with our planned presentation." Robert stepped closer to Alex, placing a hand on his shoulder, in the exact spot where the manager had gripped him earlier. But this gesture was supportive, not controlling. "You know what I find interesting," he said, addressing the room but watching the manager. "We keep hearing about the soul of these machines, the passion they represent. Yet when someone displays genuine knowledge and passion, they're shown the door." His voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the charm now. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Phone cameras had discreetly emerged, recording the increasingly tense exchange. The manager's eyes darted around the room, acutely aware that this confrontation was likely already spreading across social media. What had begun as a PR dream, Robert Downey Jr. attending their exclusive launch, was rapidly becoming a potential nightmare. "Perhaps," Robert said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the now silent showroom, "we're thinking about this all wrong." He casually leaned against the Valkyrie, something even the wealthiest guests had been careful not to do. The small act of rebellion was not lost on anyone present. "These cars," he continued, running a hand appreciatively along the vehicle's sculpted side, "they're masterpieces of engineering, but they're not museum pieces. They're meant to be understood, experienced, pushed to their limits." He looked directly at the manager. "Wouldn't the people who truly appreciate that be the ones you'd want at an event like this?" The manager's professional smile had become a grimace. "Mr. Downey, with all due respect, appreciation doesn't purchase a $3 million vehicle. We have a responsibility to our shareholders and to our brand to focus on qualified buyers." "I'll buy one," Robert said casually, as if commenting on the weather. The room fell silent again, a different kind of tension now filling the air. The manager's expression brightened instantly. "That would be absolutely wonderful, sir. We would be honored to—" "On one condition," Robert interrupted, turning to Alex. "If this young man tells me it's worth it." The manager's face went through a remarkable series of transformations: surprise, confusion, anger, and finally forced composure. The gathered elite exchanged glances, some amused, others uncomfortable. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Robert Downey Jr. was no longer just a celebrity guest. He had become the center of gravity in the room, bending the social hierarchy around him. Alex stood speechless, looking between Robert and the gleaming hypercar. The security men who had been advancing now froze in place, awaiting new instructions that weren't coming. The manager's carefully orchestrated evening had completely unraveled. "That's not how this works," the manager said, his voice tight. "Our allocation process is extremely selective. The Valkyrie units were all spoken for months ago." "I'm sure an exception could be made," Robert replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. After all, exceptions seemed to be the specialty tonight. He gestured to himself and the crowd of wealthy patrons. "We're all exceptions here, aren't we? Exceptions to normal rules about money, access, privilege." An uncomfortable ripple moved through the crowd. The truth of his words hung in the air, rarely acknowledged in these circles. "Mr. Downey, please." The manager's voice had taken on a pleading quality. "Let's not turn this into something political." "It's not political to acknowledge reality," Robert said, then turned to Alex. "What do you think? Is the car worth it?" All eyes turned to the young mechanic. The woman in the red dress snickered, clearly expecting him to gush with naive enthusiasm, but Alex surprised them all by walking slowly around the vehicle, examining it with a critical eye. "The engineering is revolutionary," he said finally. "The partnership between Aston Martin and Red Bull Racing pushed boundaries that will influence automotive design for years." He ran his fingers lightly along the curve of the fender. "But truthfully, for pure driving experience, there are better options at half the price." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The manager's mouth fell open in genuine shock. Even Robert looked surprised, though his surprise quickly transformed into something like respect. "The Valkyrie is more of a statement than a car," Alex continued, unaware of the bomb he'd just dropped. "It's brilliant, but it's designed to be exclusive more than it's designed to be driven." "Well," Robert said, breaking the stunned silence that followed, "that's the most honest thing I've heard all evening." He laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the tension. The manager stepped forward, his face contorted with barely controlled fury. "This is outrageous. You have no right to be here, undermining our event, questioning the value of a vehicle you could never afford." "That's enough," cut in a new voice. The older gentleman who had spoken earlier moved forward. "I'm Gerald Matthews, and I sit on the board of Aston Martin Lagonda." The manager went pale. "This young man," Gerald continued, gesturing to Alex, "has just demonstrated exactly what we try to instill in our engineering teams: honest evaluation and a true passion for automobiles, not just their price tags." He extended his hand to Alex. "Where did you study?" "I didn't, sir," Alex replied, shaking the offered hand. "I trained as an apprentice at Performance Composites when they were working on the Valkyrie prototype components. Before that, I was self-taught. I've been rebuilding engines since I was 14. Gerald nodded thoughtfully. "Impressive." He turned to the shell-shocked manager. "I believe we need to reconsider who receives invitations to these events. The passion for our vehicles should be the primary qualification." He looked around the room. "No offense to our valued customers, of course." The wealthy patrons murmured in response, many looking slightly embarrassed. The narrative had shifted so dramatically that even they couldn't deny the truth of what had transpired. Robert clapped his hands together once. "Well, I think this calls for a toast." He grabbed a champagne flute from a nearby tray. To passion over privilege, to understanding over ownership. He raised his glass higher. And to this young man who just proved that true appreciation doesn't come with a price tag. The crowd, sensing which way the wind was blowing, raised their glasses as well. The manager, now completely sidelined, could only watch as his exclusive event transformed before his eyes into something entirely different. A moment of genuine connection around the shared passion for automotive excellence. The remainder of the evening unfolded in a way no one could have predicted. The rigid social barriers that had defined the event seemed to dissolve as Alex became the unexpected center of attention. Wealthy collectors, initially dismissive, now approached him with genuine questions about their own vehicles. Gerald Matthews had taken him around the showroom, introducing him to key industry figures who listened intently to his insights on everything from engine tuning to composite materials. The manager had retreated to a corner, alternating between damage control calls and watching his career prospects diminish with every passing minute. The social media buzz was already building, smartphone footage of the confrontation spreading rapidly across platforms with captions like, "RDJ stands up for regular guy at elite car event," and "Iron Man delivers real-life justice." Through it all, Robert maintained a casual presence, occasionally catching Alex's eye with a knowing nod. He had witnessed this transformation before, the moment when artificial barriers crumble and genuine connection emerges. This wasn't about charity or making a point, it was about recognizing authentic passion when he saw it and refusing to let it be dismissed. "Your knowledge is impressive," Gerald said to Alex as they examined the Valkyrie's complex steering wheel, "but more importantly, your honesty is refreshing. We need more of that in this industry." The following morning, Alex's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His social media accounts had exploded overnight. Friend requests, followers, and messages poured in faster than he could process. The video clips had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments celebrating the moment when elitism had been confronted by genuine knowledge and passion. But the notification that made his hand tremble came from Gerald Matthews, an email with the subject line, "Your future at Aston Martin." Inside was an invitation to interview for a position on their development team with a note, "We value those who understand our vehicles better than anyone, especially those brave enough to speak truth." Robert had left the event without fanfare, but not before exchanging contact information with Alex. The text that arrived that morning was simple. "Some people collect cars, others understand them. The world needs more of the latter. Stay genuine. RDJ." The dealership had issued a formal apology, their statement carefully worded to acknowledge the unfortunate misunderstanding, while announcing a new community engagement initiative aimed at connecting automotive enthusiasts from diverse backgrounds with industry opportunities. The manager's name was notably absent from the release. 6 months later, Alex stood in the Aston Martin development facility, watching as a prototype underwent wind tunnel testing. His new colleagues, engineers and designers from around the world, valued his practical insights and unconventional thinking. Gerald had been right. The perspective of someone who truly understood cars from hands-on experience was invaluable. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming something of a modern parable about recognition, respect, and the true meaning of expertise. Automotive forums referenced pulling a Downey when standing up for someone being dismissed for their appearance or background. Several luxury brands had initiated programs specifically targeting talented individuals from non-traditional backgrounds. Robert had kept in touch, occasionally sending Alex photos of his own car collection with questions about optimizations or adjustments. Their friendship, unlikely as it seemed, was built on a mutual respect for authenticity. The limited edition Valkyrie had sold out completely, of course, But when the next generation of Aston Martin hypercars was unveiled 2 years later, it included an entry-level model specifically designed to be more accessible to true enthusiasts. Its name? The mechanic's dream. In a world often defined by wealth and status, a single moment of recognition had created ripples that continued to transform an industry. Sometimes true change begins when someone with influence simply says, "This person belongs here too."